There is a bottle sitting in millions of kitchens right now that most people are using completely wrong, and because of that one mistake, they are getting maybe 10% of the benefits they could be getting from it. I am not talking about a supplement, not a medication, not something you have to order online or find at a specialty store. I am talking about olive oil, specifically the extra virgin kind, and more specifically the polyphenols inside it that almost nobody talks about, that your doctor has almost certainly never explained to you, and that research is now showing can do something to your arteries, your brain, your joints, and your gut simultaneously that no single medication in existence can replicate. By the time this video ends, you will understand exactly what polyphenols are and why they are the part of olive oil that actually matters. The one mistake almost everyone makes that destroys most of these compounds before they ever reach your body, and what happens inside you, organ by organ, when you consume high polyphenol olive oil correctly every single day. Stay through to the fourth benefit, because it is the one that surprised even me the most when I first went through the research on it, and it has to do with something that happens inside your brain at night while you sleep. Before I get into what polyphenols actually do inside your body, I want to explain what they are, because this word gets thrown around constantly without anyone actually explaining it in a way that makes sense to a real person sitting at home. Polyphenols are naturally occurring chemical compounds found in plants, and they exist for a specific reason in the plant itself, which is to protect the plant from damage caused by UV radiation, insects, disease, and environmental stress. The olive tree, which grows in one of the harshest agricultural environments on Earth, thin rocky soil, intense Mediterranean sun, long dry summers, produces particularly high concentrations of these protective compounds as a response to that environmental stress. When you consume those polyphenols, something remarkable happens. The same compounds that protected the olive tree from oxidative damage and inflammation begin performing a very similar protective function inside your human body. The key polyphenol in olive oil specifically is called oleocanthal, and another major one is called oleuropein. And these two compounds have been studied more extensively than almost any other food-derived compound in the last 2 decades, with results that are, frankly, striking enough that researchers have had to check them multiple times to make sure the data was correct. Now here is the mistake I mentioned at the beginning, and this is genuinely the single most important practical thing in this entire video, so I want to make sure it lands clearly. When olive oil is exposed to high heat, the polyphenols inside it are destroyed. Not reduced, not partially maintained, destroyed at temperatures that are reached within minutes on a standard cooking surface. This means that when most people use olive oil for cooking, sautéing vegetables, frying eggs, roasting chicken, they are heating away the very compounds that make olive oil worth consuming in the first place, leaving behind essentially a generic fat source that provides calories but loses the specific biological activity that makes extra virgin olive oil different from every other cooking oil on the shelf. The smoke point of extra virgin olive oil, the temperature at which visible smoke appears, is around 375 to 405 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on the specific oil, and while the oil itself is technically safe to cook with up to that temperature, the heat-sensitive polyphenols begin degrading at much lower temperatures, starting around 200 degrees Fahrenheit, which most cooking surfaces reach within the first 2 minutes of preheating. This is why the researchers who produce the most compelling results with olive oil in clinical studies are almost always giving participants olive oil consumed raw, drizzled over food after cooking, added to salads, or taken directly by the tablespoon, rather than used as a cooking medium. The cooking use is not worthless, since some benefits remain, and it is certainly a better fat choice than many alternatives. But the polyphenol-specific benefits that are now emerging from research require consuming olive oil in a form where the polyphenols are still intact and biologically active, which means consuming it raw or minimally heated. The first benefit, and the one with the longest and most established research record behind it, is what high polyphenol olive oil does to your cardiovascular system, specifically to the walls of your blood vessels. The endothelium, the thin layer of cells lining every blood vessel in your body, performs functions that go far beyond simply containing blood within a tube. It regulates blood pressure by producing nitric oxide, which relaxes vessel walls. It controls inflammation by releasing signaling molecules. It prevents inappropriate clotting by managing the tendency of platelets to stick together. When the endothelium becomes damaged, which happens progressively with age, with high blood pressure, with elevated blood sugar, and with chronic inflammation, all of these regulatory functions deteriorate together. And the result is the progressive stiffening, narrowing, and inflammation of blood vessels that underlies most cardiovascular disease. Oleocanthal and oleuropein from olive oil have been shown in multiple clinical studies to improve endothelial function directly, meaning the lining of blood vessels becomes measurably more responsive, more capable of producing nitric oxide, and more effective at regulating its own inflammatory activity within weeks of consistent daily consumption of high polyphenol olive oil. One landmark study found that daily olive oil consumption was associated with measurably lower levels of oxidized LDL cholesterol, which is the form of LDL that actually damages artery walls, as distinct from total LDL, which is a much less precise risk marker than most people realize. The effect size in this research is large enough that several cardiovascular medicine researchers have publicly described high polyphenol olive oil as one of the most potent food-derived cardiovascular protective agents currently known. And when you understand the endothelial mechanism, this is not surprising, since you are essentially providing daily chemical support to the tissue that is most directly responsible for preventing the progression of cardiovascular disease. The second benefit, and one that has become increasingly important as research on systemic inflammation has expanded, is olive oil's effect on inflammatory markers throughout the entire body simultaneously. Oleocanthal, the polyphenol I mentioned first, has a mechanism of action that is genuinely extraordinary once you understand it. It inhibits the same enzymes, called cyclooxygenase 1 and cyclooxygenase 2, that are targeted by ibuprofen and other non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. This is not an exaggeration or an oversimplification. The molecular mechanism is genuinely comparable, which is exactly why some researchers and science journalists have described oleocanthal as a natural ibuprofen, though with one important distinction that makes it considerably more appealing for daily use than actual ibuprofen. The dose of oleocanthal in roughly 3 to 4 tablespoons of high-quality, high polyphenol extra virgin olive oil produces an anti-inflammatory effect that has been estimated as roughly equivalent to a small dose of ibuprofen, but without the gastrointestinal irritation, the blood pressure effects, and the cardiovascular risks associated with regular NSAID use that we discussed in a previous video. If you have ever noticed a peppery, slightly burning sensation at the back of your throat when swallowing high-quality extra virgin olive oil, that sensation is actually caused by oleocanthal directly stimulating the same pain receptors in your throat that ibuprofen activates in your stomach and intestines. Many olive oil experts and researchers actually recommend looking for this specific peppery throat sensation as a quality indicator, since it confirms the oleocanthal content is high enough to be biologically meaningful, which is not guaranteed by label claims or price alone. For older adults who are dealing with the kind of low-grade, chronic systemic inflammation that underlies arthritis, cardiovascular disease, metabolic dysfunction, and cognitive decline simultaneously, a food-derived compound that addresses this inflammation daily, without the side effects of pharmaceutical anti-inflammatories, represents something that simply should not be dismissed as a minor dietary detail. The third benefit, and one that connects directly to the blood sugar conversations we have had in previous videos on this channel, is olive oil's specific effect on insulin sensitivity and glucose metabolism. When olive oil polyphenols are consumed with a meal containing carbohydrates, they appear to slow gastric emptying slightly, similar to the mechanism we discussed with apple cider vinegar. And they also appear to improve the sensitivity of cells to insulin signal through direct effects on the signaling pathways inside muscle and fat cells. Clinical studies have found that replacing other dietary fats with extra virgin olive oil, even when total calorie intake remains the same, is associated with meaningfully better blood sugar control over time, with some studies measuring a reduction in HbA1c, the 3-month average blood sugar marker that is modest but clinically meaningful. What makes this particularly interesting from a practical standpoint is the synergistic relationship between this benefit and the cardiovascular benefit we already discussed, since insulin resistance and endothelial dysfunction tend to reinforce each other in a cycle that accelerates cardiovascular aging, and a single dietary addition that addresses both simultaneously, through overlapping but distinct biological mechanisms, offers a compounding advantage that researchers are still working to fully quantify. For people over 60 who are managing blood sugar concerns alongside cardiovascular risk factors, which describes an enormous portion of the population in this age group, this specific overlap is particularly relevant and worth incorporating into a practical daily dietary habit, rather than treating as theoretical background information. The fourth benefit, the one I mentioned at the beginning that surprised me the most, is what happens in the brain specifically, and it involves a process that occurs primarily during sleep. The brain has a remarkable waste clearance system called the glymphatic system, which uses cerebrospinal fluid to flush metabolic waste products, including abnormal protein fragments like amyloid beta and tau, out of brain tissue primarily during deep sleep, when the spaces between brain cells expand to allow this clearance to occur more efficiently. The accumulation of these protein fragments over years and decades is associated with the development of neurodegenerative conditions, including Alzheimer's disease, which is why sleep quality has emerged as one of the most significant modifiable risk factors for cognitive decline, independent of genetics or age. Research published in the last several years has found that oleocanthal from olive oil appears to directly support this glymphatic clearance process by promoting the activity of the proteins responsible for transporting amyloid beta across the blood-brain barrier and out of brain tissue, meaning olive oil polyphenols may be actively supporting the brain's own nightly cleaning process, rather than simply providing passive antioxidant protection. Additionally, olive oil polyphenols have been shown to reduce neuroinflammation, the low-grade inflammatory activity within brain tissue that is now understood to be a contributing factor to both the development and the progression of cognitive decline. Studies in populations with high traditional olive oil consumption have consistently found lower rates of cognitive decline compared to populations consuming less olive oil, and while dietary studies cannot establish causation with the certainty of a controlled trial, the biological mechanisms being identified in laboratory research are providing increasingly specific and compelling explanations for why this population-level observation might be real rather than coincidental. The fifth benefit is what high polyphenol olive oil does to your gut microbiome, which is an area of research that has expanded so dramatically in the last decade that its importance is genuinely difficult to overstate. The polyphenols in olive oil are largely not absorbed in the small intestine, which means they travel intact to the large intestine where they become available as food for beneficial bacteria, specifically strains in the Lactobacillus and Bifidobacterium families that are associated with reduced inflammation, better immune function, and healthier metabolic signaling throughout the body. When these bacterial populations thrive on the prebiotic compounds from olive oil polyphenols, they produce short-chain fatty acids, particularly butyrate, which I mentioned in a previous video about blood sugar, that have anti-inflammatory effects on the gut lining itself and on the broader systemic inflammatory environment throughout the body. This creates a reinforcing loop between the direct anti-inflammatory effects of oleocanthal that we discussed earlier and the indirect anti-inflammatory effects produced through supporting a healthier gut bacterial community, both working toward the same outcome of reduced systemic inflammation through different biological pathways simultaneously. Research has also found that olive oil polyphenols appear to specifically reduce the growth of certain pathogenic bacterial strains while supporting beneficial ones, a selective antimicrobial effect that may help maintain the balanced, diverse gut microbial community that is increasingly recognized as central to overall health in ways that extend far beyond digestion alone. The sixth benefit, and one that is particularly relevant for older adults given how dramatically bone health changes after 60, is what olive oil polyphenols do specifically to support bone density and reduce the rate of bone loss that accelerates significantly after menopause in women and more gradually but consistently in men as well. Bone tissue is not static, as many people implicitly assume it to be, but is instead a living tissue that is constantly being broken down by cells called osteoclasts and rebuilt by cells called osteoblasts, with the balance between these two processes determining whether bone density is maintained, gained, or lost over time. After 60, this balance shifts in a direction that favors breakdown over rebuilding, driven by hormonal changes, reduced physical activity, and chronic low-grade inflammation, all of which tip the balance away from osteoblast activity. Olive oil polyphenols, specifically oleuropein, have been shown in research to directly stimulate osteoblast activity while simultaneously reducing the activity of osteoclasts, essentially pushing the bone remodeling balance toward maintenance and rebuilding rather than net loss. Studies in populations following a traditional Mediterranean diet, where olive oil consumption is high and consistent, have found meaningfully better bone density markers in older adults compared to populations eating comparable calories from different fat sources, and the specific polyphenol content of olive oil has emerged as one of the most plausible mechanisms for this difference. Additionally, olive oil polyphenols reduce the systemic inflammation that independently accelerates bone loss by promoting osteoclast activity, meaning the anti-inflammatory benefit we already discussed for the cardiovascular system and brain has a direct secondary benefit for bone health as well, through the same mechanism operating in a different tissue. This connection between inflammation and bone density is underappreciated in most conversations about osteoporosis prevention, which tend to focus almost exclusively on calcium and vitamin D, while largely ignoring the inflammatory environment in which bone remodeling occurs, which is exactly where olive oil polyphenols can provide meaningful, daily support that works alongside rather than instead of those more commonly discussed interventions. The seventh benefit is what happens at the cellular level throughout your entire body, specifically related to a process called oxidative stress, which is one of the fundamental mechanisms underlying biological aging itself, rather than just any single disease. Every cell in your body constantly produces reactive oxygen species as a byproduct of normal energy metabolism, and under healthy conditions, these reactive molecules are neutralized quickly by the body's own antioxidant systems before they can cause significant damage to DNA, proteins, and cell membranes. When this balance is disrupted, either because reactive oxygen species are being produced in higher quantities than usual, or because the body's antioxidant defenses are overwhelmed, the resulting oxidative stress damages cellular machinery in ways that accumulate over time, contributing to the aging process itself, as well as to the development of numerous age-related diseases. Olive oil polyphenols are among the most potent naturally occurring antioxidants known, with oleuropein specifically showing antioxidant activity that significantly exceeds that of vitamin E, which has long been considered a benchmark antioxidant in several standardized comparison studies. What makes this particularly meaningful is that these polyphenols can cross into cells directly and neutralize reactive oxygen species inside the cell itself, rather than simply acting in the bloodstream or at the cell membrane, which allows them to protect cellular DNA, mitochondria, and other internal structures from the kind of oxidative damage that accumulates across decades of normal metabolism. Research measuring markers of oxidative stress in people consuming high polyphenol olive oil consistently shows meaningful reductions in these markers within weeks of beginning regular consumption, suggesting that this is not merely a theoretical benefit, but one that produces measurable changes in the oxidative environment within cells throughout the body in real people consuming real amounts of the food itself. I also want to spend a moment on the question of whether olive oil benefits are exclusive to people who are already healthy, since I hear variations of this concern often from patients who feel it may be too late to benefit from dietary changes given their existing health history. The research on this specific question is genuinely encouraging, and I want to be direct about what it shows. Studies examining the benefits of high polyphenol olive oil have been conducted in people with existing cardiovascular disease, existing metabolic syndrome, existing cognitive impairment, and existing inflammatory conditions, and they consistently find meaningful benefits in these populations, often comparable to or even greater than the benefits observed in people without established disease, because people with higher baseline levels of inflammation and oxidative stress have more room for measurable improvement when anti-inflammatory and antioxidant interventions are introduced. This does not mean olive oil is a treatment for established disease or a substitute for appropriate medical care for any specific condition. It means the biological mechanisms through which olive oil polyphenols work are relevant and active across a wide range of health starting points, and that beginning to consume high-quality extra virgin olive oil consistently today, regardless of your current health status, represents a meaningful, evidence-based decision that your future self will benefit from, even if those benefits accumulate gradually rather than appearing dramatically within the first week. Now I want to talk about how to actually choose an olive oil that has meaningful polyphenol content, because not all products labeled extra virgin olive oil are equal in this regard. And choosing poorly means you are consuming an expensive, pleasant-tasting fat without the biological activity that makes this conversation relevant. Polyphenol content in olive oil varies enormously based on the olive variety, the harvest timing, the processing method, and the storage conditions. And none of these factors are reliably communicated by standard grocery store labeling. Olives harvested earlier in the season, when the fruit is still somewhat green and less fully ripe, contain significantly higher polyphenol concentrations than olives harvested at full ripeness, since polyphenol content decreases as olives ripen fully on the tree. This is exactly why high polyphenol olive oils often have a notably stronger, more peppery, more bitter flavor profile than the mild, smooth olive oils that many people are more familiar with, since that bitterness and pepperiness is literally the taste of the polyphenols themselves. Processing speed matters enormously as well, since olives that are cold-pressed within a few hours of harvest, before oxidation can begin degrading the polyphenols, retain dramatically more of these compounds than olives that sit for hours or days before pressing. Look for oils that specify a harvest date rather than just a best-by date, since freshness is the single best proxy for polyphenol content when more specific testing data is not available, and polyphenol content begins declining meaningfully after about 12 to 18 months from harvest, regardless of storage conditions. Store your olive oil in a dark glass bottle or tin, away from heat and direct light, since both accelerate polyphenol degradation, and use it within a few months of opening rather than keeping a large bottle for extended periods. From a practical daily use standpoint, research suggests that the amounts used in clinical studies showing meaningful benefits typically range from 1 to 4 tablespoons of high-quality extra virgin olive oil daily, consumed primarily raw rather than as a cooking medium, though using it in cooking provides other benefits even if the polyphenol content is partially reduced. Drizzling it over vegetables after roasting, adding it to salads, using it as a dipping element, or simply taking a tablespoon of a high-quality, peppery, extra virgin olive oil before a meal are all practical, sustainable approaches. Pairing olive oil specifically with foods that also contain other polyphenols, including leafy greens, tomatoes particularly when cooked, legumes, and berries, appears to create a synergistic effect where the combined polyphenol intake from multiple sources produces greater anti-inflammatory benefit than any single source alone, which is exactly why the Mediterranean dietary pattern as a whole, rather than any single food within it, has proven so consistently associated with better health outcomes across multiple long-term studies. Olive oil is the centerpiece of that pattern for a reason, but its benefits are amplified rather than diminished when it is consumed as part of a broader dietary approach that includes the other whole food polyphenol sources that complement its specific biological activity. I want to walk through a realistic, practical protocol for how to incorporate the amounts of high polyphenol olive oil that have shown benefit in research, because the difference between knowing this information and actually applying it comes down to specific, concrete habits, rather than a general intention to use more olive oil. Most of the clinical research showing meaningful cardiovascular, anti-inflammatory, and cognitive benefits uses amounts ranging from 2 to 4 tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil daily, and importantly, this amount needs to be consumed consistently over weeks and months, rather than in large occasional amounts to produce sustained biological effects, since the polyphenols clear from your system within roughly 24 hours and need to be replenished daily to maintain their protective activity in your tissues. A practical approach for most people involves incorporating olive oil at 2 or 3 specific daily moments, rather than trying to track tablespoons throughout the day. A common strategy is a single tablespoon of high-quality, peppery extra virgin olive oil taken directly before the first meal of the day, which requires no preparation and takes approximately 5 seconds, followed by olive oil used generously as a finishing drizzle over whatever vegetables or protein is being served at lunch and dinner, added after cooking rather than before or during, specifically to preserve the polyphenol content. This combination typically reaches the target range without requiring any significant change to the meals themselves beyond the finishing drizzle, which most people find actually improves the flavor of their food rather than representing any kind of sacrifice or difficulty. Pairing olive oil with specific other foods that are also rich in polyphenols appears to amplify the benefits of both through a mechanism called polyphenol synergy, where different polyphenol compounds from different food sources appear to enhance each other's absorption and biological activity in ways that make the combined intake more effective than the sum of the parts taken separately. Tomatoes, particularly cooked or concentrated tomatoes like tomato paste or slow-roasted tomatoes, contain lycopene and other polyphenols whose bioavailability increases significantly when consumed with fat, making olive oil specifically an ideal accompaniment. Leafy greens including spinach, kale, and arugula contain their own distinct polyphenol profiles that have been shown to complement olive oil's anti-inflammatory activity at a tissue level. Legumes, which we have discussed in multiple previous videos for their fiber and blood sugar benefits, also contain meaningful polyphenol concentrations that pair well with olive oil, both culinarily and biologically. Even a simple meal of roasted vegetables drizzled with a generous amount of high-quality extra virgin olive oil, served alongside a small portion of legumes and followed by a small handful of berries, represents a combination of polyphenol sources that delivers something approaching the full Mediterranean dietary pattern in a single eating occasion. And when this kind of combination is repeated consistently across multiple meals each week, the cumulative biological effect accumulates in a way that individual food choices analyzed separately simply cannot capture. I also want to address something that comes up regularly when I discuss olive oil in a health context, which is the caloric density concern. since olive oil is indeed a high-calorie food at approximately 120 calories per tablespoon, and many older adults have been advised to watch their caloric intake carefully for weight management reasons. The research on this specific question is reassuring rather than alarming. Multiple studies tracking total calorie intake and body weight in people following Mediterranean-style diets high in olive oil have consistently found that the high olive oil consumers do not gain meaningfully more weight than low olive oil consumers despite the caloric contribution, and some studies have found the reverse. The proposed mechanisms include olive oil's effects on satiety hormones that reduce overall food intake later in the day, its effects on fat metabolism through gut microbiome changes, and its effects on how efficiently calories from other foods are metabolized. None of this means calories from olive oil are literally free, or that unlimited consumption is appropriate, but it does mean that the concern about olive oil's caloric content should not prevent someone from consuming the 2 to 4 tablespoon daily amounts associated with meaningful health benefits, since the evidence suggests this amount does not produce the weight gain that pure caloric arithmetic might suggest. If this video gave you a new way of thinking about something that has been sitting in your kitchen, potentially underused or misused, leave a comment below telling me whether you already use olive oil daily and whether you notice that peppery throat sensation the next time you try a good quality extra virgin version, because I am genuinely curious how many people watching already experienced that and did not know what it meant. Take care of yourself, and I will see you in the next one.